Alrighty, so this presentation is going to be for lab stuff. And no, I don't want to, I never want to switch to tablet mode. That's the navigation prompt. Anywho, that doesn't matter to you. I'm using this very excellent 3D brain model, and this appears to be an actual scan using a camera of a real human brain. I'll point out how I know that in just a moment. So I am using that Sketchfab website where there's a bunch of free and open source 3D models, just like I did for some of the bones. And this is I picked this one out of the bunch because it's the most realistic, again, because it's a real human brain. So how do I know that? Well, let's turn around. Okay. So if we look, we can see this is the lateral view of the brain, by the way. And this would be, let's see, the right hemisphere from the lateral aspect, so looking at the side of the brain, side of the head. Sorry, I just do the 3D turning around in my head thing. So the reason that I can tell that this is a scan of a real brain is because there are these cut marks. And that happens when you're trying to remove the skull, or excuse me, remove the calvarium using a bone saw. It's pretty easy to have the blade of the bone saw drop a little bit too far through the calvarium and accidentally nick the brain. It's basically because the cranial bones are so thin and flat, thanks to intramembranous ossification, that if you're not super careful and you don't really feel for the drop of the saw as it passes through the spongy bone middle, and you're not careful about the after that, then you can nick the brain. So that's why these cut marks are here. But overall, that's not a criticism of this dissection. This is actually a really nice dissection of the brain. So no shade from me. I know how hard this dissection is to do, and I think the 3D model is pretty rad. So let's start with some brain anatomy. So we're just going to do basic cerebral hemisphere stuff first. And one of the things I want to point out, and let's use a less angry color than red. I don't like to use red. So you'll notice that there's these wrinkles on the brain. And the bumps, which I'm going to use a highlighter tool for. So the bumps are called gyri. So like I'm outlining right now one gyrus. So the bumpy uppy parts, which I know is a stupid way to say it, but it's the best way I can describe it. So the bumpy portion of the wrinkle is a gyrus. So let's label that. So gyrus is singular. Multiple of them is gyri. So here's a gyrus, here's a gyrus, here's another gyrus. You get the idea. So the name for the grooves between gyri are called sulci. So the little crevices that divide the gyri from each other, each individual one of those is called a sulcus. Plural is sulci. S-U-L-C-U-S. Sorry, let me try to write that again. S-U-L-C-U-S. There we go. And then there's more than one, so you're going to use the plural. It's sulci. So when you look at the edge of the brain, or the outside aspect of the cerebrum, which is the one with all the lobes and junk, that's what you're looking at. The outer view in its entirety is the cerebral cortex. And I'm not going to point at the cerebral cortex because the cerebral cortex is what you are looking at in this picture. The cerebral cortex's surface anatomy is such that the cortex is thrown into folds called gyri, and those folds of cortex are divided from each other by grooves called sulci. So Cortex and medulla are a little bit tricky to understand without a coronally sectioned brain. So I'll do that later, but essentially the idea is if you were to cut this like so and look at the cut face of it, so turn it around and look at the cut edge, what you would see would be something that looks like that, where you could see the sectional anatomy of it. And the outer edge is made out of gray matter, including the surfaces of the gyri and sulci, but the inner part is white matter, which forms the cerebral medulla. So cortex is just a word that means the outermost edge part of a tissue. So there's lots of cortices all over the place. This one is the cerebral cortex. And let's use a little yellow to indicate that it's this edge tissue. That's not actually very visible. Let's try it in blue, is what I was trying to do. There we go. And then the middle is the white matter, which is the medulla. But you can't see the white matter in the middle unless you cut the brain. So when you look at the brain from the outside, so if this is your eye, let's draw an eyelid, and then an eyeball, and then eyelashes. So if you're looking at the outside of the brain, what you're seeing is the cortex. So if that's still confusing to you, I understand. Just go ahead and ask me about it. We can get that cleared up. But the reason that it's hard to understand the cortex if you don't have a cut or coronally sectioned brain is because you can't see the difference between that and the medulla. All right, so let's do some lobes, shall we? So first, if we're going to do lobes, it would be a good idea for us to do some directions first. So this is the superior side. This is the inferior side. This is anterior. And this is posterior. So that's the directional orienting information that you need to make sure that you're lobing correctly, for starters. So I'm just going to go ahead and highlight the lobes in colors, which is nice and it helps. Okay, so let's start with our frontal lobe. It would be cool if that dot was bigger. There we go. So the frontal lobe is, as you might predict, in the front. And it goes a little bit further back than you might think. So there's some important landmarks here. There's some specific gyri that form dividing lines. And so I'll explain what those are in a moment. Oops, let's get rid of that. There we go. There we go. So if I make my dot even bigger, I can color more efficiently. So this one that I'm highlighting in blue is the frontal lobe. And just to give you some, additional context for function and whatnot, this is where most of your personality lives. It's the seat of judgment and intent. It's where your moral compass lives, your perception of right and wrong, a lot about your mood and attitude as well. And a lot of what we know about the brain, and specifically the function of the frontal lobe, comes from injury studies. So when people get their frontal lobe damaged, doctors and neurologists and scientists can make observations about how their personality and other attributes of them changed after their injury. And it's not uncommon for frontal lobe injuries, specifically TBIs, traumatic brain injuries to the frontal lobe, to result in personality changes, which is scary but true. So perhaps the most famous instance of that was the case of Phineas Gage, who got a railroad spike accidentally impaled through his face. It went up through the bottom side of his jaw and came out through one of his eye sockets, and it passed through part of his frontal lobe on the way. This happened in the 1800s, I believe, so the likelihood of him surviving that was pretty slim, but somehow he did. But afterwards, he turned into a angry, work-averse alcoholic who was prone to fits of rage and had a really hard time processing information. whereas before he was a relatively docile human being. So that's one of the earliest sort of examples. So you can look up Phineas gauge if you want. Frontal lobe. So you have two of these, one per side. So this is one cerebral hemisphere. There's of course one on the other side as well. So now I'm going to come down and we're going to highlight the temporal lobe. Again, I would like a bigger dot, please and thank you. So the temporal lobe is this one that kind of comes down almost like an ear flap on a hat. Like so. So that's the temporal lobe. Notice it's not temper, T-E-M-P-E-R, it's tempor, T-E-M-P-O-R. Temporal means of or pertaining to time. So one of the reasons for this lobe's name is its association with a variety of cognitive tasks, but also perception of time. It's also a place where things like speech and language live on one side, for example. We'll get into that when we get into chapter 14, brain anatomy, a little bit more heavily, but that's temporal lobe stuff. Also, auditory perception, because it's right near the external and internal acoustic meatus and your auditory stuff. Okay, now back here, is the parietal lobe. And if you're sensing a theme here that's like, hey, these seem like they're named for the skull bones that lie over the top of them, you would be correct. So from that perspective, learning the skull first is good because it makes learning the lobes of the brain a lot easier, with one exception, the insula, which you actually can't see here. Insula means hidden, and the insula is the hidden lobe. So we'll have another look at that from another view later. This is the parietal lobe. So again, you have two of these, one per side. The parietal bones go over the top of them. And then finally, let's make this purple. We have the occipital lobe, which is at the back and underneath the occipital bone. So let's just color that in. So speaking of cerebral cortex, you'll notice that it's wrinkly. So in the animal kingdom, among vertebrates, brain size, so the total bigness and weight of the brain, is not as strongly correlated with intelligence as you might think. What's more strongly correlated is brain wrinkliness. So if you have a wrinkly brain, you tend to be an intelligent analytical creature. If you have a smooth brain, you tend to be a fairly rudimentary creature whose cognition is not especially complex. But correlation does not equal causation, and that's not always perfectly true. There are plenty of creatures that are capable of quite complex behavior and other activities, even with a relatively smooth brain. So part of that is a human perception of animal intelligence and judgments. But if you look at the animals that we consider to be smart, so dolphins, for example, they have really wrinkly brains that look a lot like ours. Okay, so those are the lobes that you can see. Now, you might be wondering, how did you figure out where the frontal lobe ended and where the parietal lobe began? And the answer is, there is this crack, which I'm going to make be yellow, I guess, right here, which I'm going to, yeah. So this little yellow crack, which remember the crevices are called a sulcus, is the central sulcus. I'll label that, don't worry. And the central sulcus is important for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is it divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and it also separates two important structures, which I'll show you. One of them is, let's make this a little bit darker blue. I think that's appropriate. So this gyrus that's right in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. And then similarly at the back, this gyrus here, maybe I'll make this like reddish. I think that might be better so you can see it better. Yeah, that's better. So this gyrus that's across the central sulcus from the precentral gyrus, and don't worry, I'll write both of those as well, is the postcentral gyrus. And these have very important roles, which is one of the reasons that I'm pointing them out. So the precentral gyrus is part of the frontal lobe, the postcentral gyrus is part of the parietal lobe. So the precentral gyrus is the site of your motor neurons that control your skeletal muscles. And your postcentral gyrus is the sensory map for your somatic nervous system. So the sensations in your skin, etc., nerve endings in your skin, the nerves that are associated with the sensory perception for your skin and tissues in a particular area, the postcentral gyrus is where all those neurons live. So we'll talk about this more in lecture, but I wanted to point them out to you anatomically because they're obvious and also they're involved in how you can sort of eyeball the end of the frontal lobe and the beginning of the parietal lobe. So I mentioned some stuff about what the frontal lobe does. Let's flesh that out for the rest of the lobes, just so that we can sort of have a good rudimentary or basic understanding. So I said this is judgment, thought, critical thinking, intent, morality, moral compass, personality, etc. The frontal lobe is also, of course, part of motor control. The temporal lobe's function is a little bit lopsided, so on the left side in particular, there's some specifics about it, but in general, it's for auditory perception and processing and language stuff, and a little bit of face recognition as well. The parietal lobe is primarily sensory, so keeping track of your body senses, and the occipital lobe is visual processing and perception. So what that means is if you get whacked on the back of the head and your occipital lobe gets damaged, you can actually become blind even if there's nothing wrong with your eyeballs or your optic nerves. It's the processing that is the thing that's being affected. So more on that in lecture. Okay, so that is the lateral aspect. So we're looking at the lobes and all the gyri and whatnot. And now I'm going to delete this, spin it around, and we're going to look at the medial aspect of a sagittally sectioned brain. And let's do that. Okay, so you'll notice that there are some annotations here. I'm going to get rid of them just because I want to be able to hide annotations. There we go. Just be able to point at some stuff without having things in the way. So let's look at the stuff that we have here. So one of the major obvious things that you might notice is, I'm going to primarily rely on the highlighter again because it's just easier. This structure here, which is the big, huge, thick tract of white matter that connects the two hemispheres of your brain. So in this case, it's been cut in half, but this is the corpus callosum. So body is what corpus means, and callosum means tough or resistant. So this is basically just when you cut through the brain, it's difficult to get through. So that's the corpus callosum, and that's the major connector. So one of the words you're going to learn to associate with that is decussation, which is where via white matter tracts, information passes from one side of the brain to the other. So the corpus callosum is important for that. In some cases where people have debilitating grand mal seizures, an effective treatment for that is to actually cut the corpus callosum so that the two halves of the brain can't communicate via it anymore, which seems extreme and dramatic. And you would be right. However, it is the only treatment that works for some folks. So as weird as that is, it's true. Sorry about that, my computer glitched out for a second, but we're back. So moving right along, we've got the corpus callosum connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. And then on the bottom, across this membrane from it, which I will show you, is this structure. Oops, let's make this dot some bigger. There we go. Called the fornix. And I ran into an important structure a little bit, so let's just revise that. Okay, so there's our fornix. So if the corpus callosum is the roof, the fornix is kind of the floor. And then even though this looks like solid tissue here, it's not. It's actually a membrane that is dividing two fluid-filled spaces from each other. So if you were to poke through that, you would enter one of the ventricles of the brain, the lateral ventricle. So because it's a divider, and because in reality, even though it's not really reflected in this model because it's 3D and it's the internet, but it is semi-transparent. So we call that the septum, meaning divider, and pellucidum, meaning pellucid or semi-transparent. So if you were to poke through that, you would end up inside of the lateral ventricle. But the ventricles of the brain we're going to save for a different video because it's easier to view them with a different 3D rendering than this one is. So that's kind of the idea. Okay, so then we're going to have, going down a little bit more, one of my favorite brain structures of all time, the thalamus, which is your sensory relay center. This little round guy. There's two of them, one per side. And then, let me see if I can get a different color red to work. Yeah, so there's that little tissue right there. Is part of the thalamus, but it has a specific name. So the big red oval is the thalamus, and this dot is the massa intermedia, which is also called the interthalamic adhesion. So what I'm going to do, because I need to be able to draw here on something that's nearby, is I'm going to make a little asterisk after I finish highlighting again, and I'm going to just write those words down off to the side, because otherwise I won't be able to label other stuff. So, massa intermedia / interthalamic adhesion. So the two halves of the thalamus are joined by that little dot there. Okay, moving on down. This triangle-shaped region here is called the hypothalamus. I'll try rewriting that because it's not coming out as good as I wanted it to. Hypothalamus. There we go. Sorry about that. It's just hard to write really tiny on this thing. So the green triangular shaped region right there is the hypothalamus. So the thalamus is a sensory relay center. It basically receives sensory information and it sends it to the correct location on the cortex. The hypothalamus is basically one of your major control centers. So um, thirst, water balance, body temperature, metabolism, uh, growth, development, sexual reproduction, puberty, all kinds of things are coordinated by the hypothalamus via its role in the endocrine system and the handshake it performs with the nervous system. So it's got a lot going on for being like just a relatively like tiny little region. You'll learn all about it in chapter 18 next term. So not quite yet. Now you're just learning to recognize it. Back here, and I'm saying back on purpose because it's at the rear, so the front is over here. So that's the anterior part. But let's look at the back. So this little sort of circular guy in cross section is the pineal gland. I'm sorry if you just heard my bulldog groan. He's displeased with me for not cuddling him. So, pineal gland. So you're noticing I'm probably not saying pineal gland like you might expect. I'm saying pineal gland. There's a reason for that, and that is that the pineal gland is named that because it looks like a pine cone, or at least the person who discovered it thought it did. So it's literally pineal, not pineal. So if you hear somebody say pineal, correct them if you want to be annoying. I'm annoying. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is for a variety of things, but one of them is that I studied the pineal gland and its secretions and their effects on the hypothalamus in grad school. So I know a lot about this gland. It's a pet gland of mine, and so I get extra peevish when somebody either pronounces it wrong or, as many people are fond of doing, insist that it does something that it does not do. So during the daytime, the pineal gland makes serotonin. At night, it makes melatonin because they're part of the same biosynthetic pathway. It is not like a place where fluoride crystallizes your consciousness. It's not your third eye. It's none of that. It does transiently produce a little bit of DMT as an intermediate step in the biosynthetic pathways that are involved in the production of melatonin and serotonin, respectively. But here's the thing that those people don't understand about intermediate steps. Those chemicals exist for a blip of time transiently before they are almost immediately turned into something else. So the mysticism around the pineal gland is mostly unfounded. It has a very well understood and predictable job. So, sorry. All right, so that's the pineal gland, and then unfortunately the brainstem has been cut off here, so I can't go further down into the like lower diencephalon / upper brainstem because of that, but that's fine. We'll do it in another video. What's some other things that are relevant here? If there was a pituitary gland here, I'll draw where it would be. What color do I want to make it? I don't know. How about solid pink? Yeah, sure. Why not? So it would hang down from the hypothalamus on a little stalk and kind of look like that. And then this thing right here is the stub of what's called the optic chiasm. Chiasm refers to the Greek character chi, which looks like an X. That stub is where your optic nerves cross each other, forming the optic chiasm. So it's right there, this little cut stub thingy. And that's about all. Oh, I guess mammillary body, we can't miss that. So this little orange doohickey is the mammillary body. All right, and that's mostly all that my class has to know about here. I mentioned the lateral ventricles of the brain and said we'd do the ventricles a little bit later because they're not really easy to indicate here. But what you should note is that the thalamus, the two halves of it, come together and there's a space around the interthalamic adhesion that is filled with fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, and so that is the third ventricle. The thalamus actually encloses the third ventricle, and then via this little groove here, which is also a fluid space, it's called the cerebral aqueduct. Allows cerebrospinal fluid to flow down into the fourth ventricle, which you can't see here because it's been cut off along with the rest of the other structures. Let's see. The only other things that I need to point out are the commissures. So we've got this little guy right here, which is the anterior commissure, and then the posterior commissure is neighbors with the pineal gland, which I've kind of buried it a little bit, but it's right here. Oops. There we go. Right there. I'll write that in black because that orange didn't go very well. Posterior commissure. And a commissure, similar to the corpus callosum, is a place where white matter tracts cross from one side to the other. So the way that we say crossing over from left to right or right to left in neuroanatomy terms is decussation. So I'm just going to point out these three things are sites of decussation. There we go. Okay, and that is the both lateral and medial aspect anatomy of the cerebrum and parts of the diencephalon, which is thalamus, hypothalamus stuff. So in another video, I will show you the meninges and also the brainstem and the diencephalon, the parts of the diencephalon, and we'll look at the fluid spaces in the brain as well, the ventricles. So those will be other videos that I'll make with another 3D model. But thank you for your attention. I hope that helped. And if you're, not my student and you're just here to learn, awesome, good for you. I hope this was helpful. Because of that, just briefly before we go, since I know people will probably be wondering about it, it's not something that's on my students list, but the gyrus that is right on the outside of the corpus callosum is called the cingulate gyrus. So that gyrus would start right on the edge there. Okay, that's all. I will see you in the next video, but I'm going to get this posted first. Toodles!